I apologize, everyone. The way that my setup is, I actually can't see the chat while I am presenting, but please feel free to throw questions in there. And as soon as I get through the slide deck, I'm happy to run through and answer those questions. So presentation today, we're going to be talking a little bit about OWASP risk ranking methodology and kind of in the context of how you can utilize this to have a more contextualized vulnerability management program. So a quick rundown of what we're going to go over. I'll do a quick introduction of myself. We will briefly touch on a few definitions. We'll talk about why you should choose a vulnerability risk management or a vulnerability management program that is risk-based versus your traditional vulnerability management programs. We'll also talk a little bit about the risk ranking methodology at a high level. Then we'll dive into the real world examples of like where these factors are going to come from. I'll run through a quick implementation example to give you an idea of the real world, how this is going to work. And then we'll talk about some things that you should consider prior to implementing a risk-based type of program for vulnerability management. So a little bit about me. I got both my bachelor's and master's degree in digital forensics. My master's was from the University of Central Florida. Once I graduated there, I started applying to any cybersecurity related job I could find and wound up landing an amazing job with Fortress Information Security here in Orlando as a junior vulnerability analyst. From that point on, I've kind of worked with the same client, started branching out to a couple of different clients in the critical infrastructure world, working on their vulnerability management programs, as well as assisting with the development of custom software that we've built for our clients to utilize in their vulnerability management solutions. On the lighter side, I do have two puppies. The first one is Sammy. Our youngest is Scout, and a wonderful fiance who I will be marrying here at the end of May, which I'm very, very excited about. So that's a little bit about me. So let's start off with why choose risk-based vulnerability management. First and foremost, risk-based vulnerability management is going to utilize factors or information from the vulnerabilities, the affected assets, as well as potential threats to help you gain a bigger picture of the overall severity, as opposed to your traditional vulnerability management styles or frameworks that focus pretty heavily on the severity of the vulnerability and the vulnerability itself. Your traditional vulnerability management programs don't really take into account that often a ton of information about your specific environment or about the specific threats that may be looking to exploit a particular vulnerability within your environment. One of the other reasons is when it comes to vulnerability management, one size does not fit all for businesses. A risk-based vulnerability management program allows a business to determine what is a high risk for them. And along with that, with the understanding of knowing what is a high risk to you and your business, it helps you to better focus your staffing resources to patch vulnerabilities that are most likely to impact you, as opposed to having to focus so heavily on any vulnerability that comes out that may be high or critical. And as we move through this implementation examples, you'll begin to see how a risk-based approach can help neutralize some of those higher severity threats if they don't necessarily impact or apply to your business. And the final reason is, again, along the same lines, it allows a business to determine their risk landscape and overall security posture in a much more meaningful way. It becomes a little less arbitrary and starts to be more relevant to you and the situation that you're in. So the particular OWASP risk ranking methodology, it starts off with your standard risk rating model, which is essentially that risk is going to equal the likelihood of an event multiplied by the impact of that event. The OWASP model does contain 6 steps, which we're going to dive into detail on each one of those in the upcoming slides. But starting at the top, you have to identify your risk. Then you move on to estimating your likelihood factors, estimating your impact factors, determining your overall severity, deciding what to fix. And then the beauty of this model is then determining how to customize this model even further to fit your particular needs. Before we can jump into starting to implement those OWASP steps, there is a precursor step that you'll hear me emphasize over and over again in this presentation that is super, super critical to implementing any risk rating vulnerability management program, and that's asset classification. Without proper asset classification, the effectiveness of your risk rating model or your vulnerability management program as a whole, it decreases dramatically. You have to know what you have in order to be able to protect what you have. So that's the basic premise of this step. And in this step, you're going to want to determine, what impact do your particular assets have on the business? What is the value of those assets to your business? You want to determine who's responsible for them. Who are you going to be reaching out to when it comes time to actually patch these items or make that configuration change or implement some kind of mitigating control? You need to determine, how accessible is this asset or system to the attacker? Is this something they can easily get to, or is it buried deep, deep behind a diode, behind firewalls, air gapped, whatever it is? What is the accessibility there? You'll want to look at compliance requirements. Do you have any compliance organizations that you have to report to, especially for these particular assets? And would there be any kind of implication to your business if a compromise was to take place or a successful attack was launched? And then finally, the technical details. You want to get as much information around these assets as possible. Everything from what operating system it's running to the IP address or addresses that it's running. What controls are in place? Do you have logging? Are those logs being reviewed? Is there an IDS? Are you IPS? Whatever kind of technical details you can get about the assets, you want to try to collect that and consolidate that to utilize moving forward. So once you've completed your asset classification or your pre-steps, you can dive right into the risk rating, the OWASP risk rating module or methodology. And the very first step here is pretty straightforward. You have to determine a risk. You have to determine the vulnerability, threat, and asset combination that you want to get a risk rank on. Once you've picked out, those 3 items, you can then move into estimating your likelihood factors. Now, your likelihood is going to be composed of factors that are related to the threat agents and factors that are related to your vulnerabilities. Each portion of this calculation has 4 individual factors underneath it. And each of those factors in the OWASP model come with a qualitative value, something descriptive that can be used if you have a person doing this. And those qualitative values then correlate back to a quantitative value that's then used in the calculation itself. So for threat agent factors, we're going to be talking about the threat agent skill level. How technically skilled is the group that may potentially be exploiting this vulnerability? How motivated are they? What is their overall opportunity, or what resources are required for them to exploit this vulnerability? And what's the estimated size of the group? Is it an exceptionally large group of people who can exploit this vulnerability? Or is this a small group of 1 or 2 people with super specialized access that would only be able to successfully exploit the vulnerability? So those are the kind of 4 factors that you need to run through and determine a score for. You can see that the scores vary based on the factors, ranging anywhere from 0 to 9 for each factor. Again, we move on to our vulnerability factors. We have another 4 factors here. we're going to be talking about the ease of discovery. How easy is it for a group of threat agents to discover the vulnerability? Your ease of exploit. How easy is it for a group of threat agents to exploit the vulnerability? You'll be talking about your awareness. How well known is the vulnerability? And you'll need to determine a value for an intrusion detection. How likely is it that if there isn't a successful exploit of this vulnerability on this asset, that would be detected by some kind of system. And you can see, again, there's a varying range in values, both qualitatively and quantitatively, that can be used by an analyst or in some kind of automated fashion, depending on your implementation. Once we've determined our likelihood factors, we can then move on to determining our impact factors. The impact factors are mostly around your assets, your asset information, and those are broken down into your technical factors and then your business factors. So you have the technical side of the asset, and then how does that asset actually impact your business, and in what form. So we'll start with our technical impact factors. Again, 4 factors here. We have the loss of confidentiality, the loss of integrity, the loss of availability, and the loss of accountability. Now, if you're familiar with the CIA triad, those first 3, they're pretty big in the cybersecurity world. We add in the accountability to kind of go along with taking into account if we're able to trace the actions back to a particular individual, that may lessen the severity in a very slight way. So loss of accountability is taken into account here. Once we've got the technical factors, we'll go ahead and move on into the business factors. These are going to be your financial damage, how much of a financial impact would result from an exploit on this particular asset. Is it going to cost your company a ton of money, or are you looking at negligible costs? Then we'll look at your reputation damage. How much would an exploit result in harm to the business as far as their reputation is concerned? Now we have a non-compliance factor. How much exposure does non-compliance introduce? And this, especially in the critical infrastructure world, where I have done most of my vulnerability management and got most of my experience, this is a really, really big one for them. There are a lot of compliance agencies and compliance rules and regulations that have to be followed. So this can have a really, really big impact in determining what to fix and when. And our final factor here is privacy violation. How much personally identifiable information could be disclosed if this asset was to be compromised? Now that we have, we've kind of run through the factors, we move on to step 4. And this is where you get kind of the answer to the overall question, which is, how severe is this for me? This is where we start determining our overall severity of this risk. The first step is to calculate the overall likelihood. We take the quantitative values that we determined in step 2 for estimating the overall likelihood factors of the threat agent and the vulnerability, and we plug those into the formula. Now, if you're looking on the screen here, you can see this formula is nothing more than taking an average of those 8 factors, the combination of the 4 from the threat and the 4 from the vulnerability. That score is then going to correlate back to a severity of either low, medium, or high for that particular, for the overall likelihood. So a low is going to be any number from 0 to less than 3. Your medium is going to be any number from 3 to less than 6. And a high is going to be anything from 6 to 9. So if you look at the example I have on the screen, you can see that the average of these factors for the overall likelihood came out to 5.62, which is less than 6, which puts it in the medium category. We then go ahead and do the exact same process to determine the overall impact. We plug in our values, average them out across the 8 factors, and determine an overall impact score of, in this example, 7, which correlates to high. Once you've got your overall likelihood and overall impact determined, we can then utilize this heat map essentially to map out, we have an impact of high, a likelihood of medium. We're going to draw a line straight to where those two meet on this graph. So in this particular example, those factors across calculated out to a high. Once you've determined your overall severity, now you get to the fun part, deciding what to fix. This is where you kind of fall back into a traditional vulnerability management mindset, where most of the time you're going to fix the most severe item first. There are some other considerations to make. Remediating lower severity risk items may increase your overall security if that lower item spans a large number of assets. So, for example, suppressing insecure SSL ciphers at a reverse proxy might mitigate hundreds of open SSL vulns across a server until they can be patched. So although the individual score of that one particular open SSL vuln on that one particular server may come out to a relatively low score, applying some kind of mitigating control or even applying a patch across an entire group of like assets may actually be more beneficial to you than skipping that lower severity item and going back to the higher ones. It all depends on what works best for you and what makes the most sense. And then, of course, the other consideration is you always want to compare the cost of fixing something versus the cost of the actual risk itself. Not all risks are worth fixing. There are times when the cost of fixing a vulnerability may be higher than the cost associated with the actual exploitation of that vulnerability on the system. So it's always important to make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you're going over these. Sometimes it just makes sense to take the risk. Not always, but sometimes. The final step, which is what makes the OWASP methodology so great, in my opinion, is getting to the point where you get to customize this model to fit you. This is where you get to really make this work for you and your business. There are many different things you can do to customize that, anything from adding factors. This generally comes into play, especially in my experience, I've seen this a lot when you have a very high OT asset population. You may need some additional factors to take into account safety or reliability or productivity. And those factors can simply be added to the area that it makes the most sense. In the example I gave with safety, you would probably add that to the business impact on your overall impact rating. And all that does then is add another value that is then added to the average. So instead of dividing by 8, you would divide by 9. But that it gives you the ability to add some factors that make more sense to you that maybe aren't available in the standard model. The other thing that can happen is the customization of options. So it may make more sense for you if you think about the non-compliance factor. It had 3 values. The standard values are either high violation, clear violation, or no violation. It may make sense to you to take factors given to you by specific compliance agencies that may have 4 or 5 different levels of violation that you would want to score appropriately based on that information. And the final way that this can be customized is by adding weighting to factors. By default, all factors are weighted the same in this approach. It may make sense for you to weight some factors higher than others to have that factor play more of a role in determining your overall severity. So I want to talk very quickly about where this information comes from. So your threat agent factors, that's all going to come from your threat intelligence sources. Knowing your adversaries is going to be super critical to making this effective. There are tons of threat intelligence sources. There's government sites like the US CERT. Your critical vendors generally put out some threat intelligence information. So Microsoft, Cisco, SecureWorks, all the big names. You're also going to have a ton of public sources. There are some really reputable cybersecurity blogs out there. And, Twitter is a great source. A curated Twitter feed can provide more threat intelligence, useful threat intelligence to you and your business than a lot of other places. So those are just a few examples of where you can get your threat information from that you can then use to help you set your factors. Your vulnerability factors generally map back to your CVSS scoring in some way. It can utilize a combination of CVSS factors. So your ease of discovery and ease of exploit are going to come from your base metric groups. As I said, that can be a direct correlation to one of those values, or if it makes more sense to you and your business, it can be a kind of an average or some kind of combination of multiple values from that group. There is no set in stone way that these factors have to be set in this formula. So whatever makes the most sense to you is perfectly fine. Your technical and business impact factors, that is going to come again from that pre-step, step 0 of your asset inventory. Your asset classification is going to mean everything when it comes to figuring out these impact factors for your assets. It's very, very, very important. So I want to run through a quick example where I think this shows where OWASP really can shine for you and your business. So in this example, we have a low impact asset. We have our technical impact factors being relatively low. Our loss of confidentiality is going to be minimal. Our loss of integrity is going to be minimal. Minimal seriously corrupted data. Our loss of availability is going to be limited to secondary services that are interrupted. And our accountability, loss of accountability, this is going to be a fully traceable event. We're going to know exactly who exploited this and when. For our business impact factors, we're looking at minor financial damage, minimal reputational damage, a minor violation, and a small number of PII disclosure for our privacy violation. So if we take those factors, plug them into our formula, we'll get an overall impact score of 2.25. Again, an overall impact severity of low. Now let's say we're going to be, as a part of our risk rating case, we're going to be taking a critical vulnerability. And along with that, we're going to assume kind of almost a worst case scenario threat, which would be, an internet attacker or somebody with a super high, it's a threat group with really high factors involved. So if we look at our vulnerability factors, again, this vulnerability is easy to discover. There are automated tools available to exploit it. Even with this critical vulnerability, we don't necessarily know at this point. Let's say it's a brand new critical vuln that came out. We may not know exactly how aware everyone is, but it's still pretty high. And our intrusion detection system is basically non-existent. For our threat factors, again, we've got a super high skill set for this group. They're very highly motivated. They do need to have some type of special access or resources, but once they gain that access or gain those resources, the size of this group is anyone who has an internet access and those particular skills. So if we take that information, we plug it into our formula, we get an overall likelihood of 7.125 and an overall likelihood severity of high. When we take that and map it on our heat map, we've got an impact of low, a likelihood of high. That gets us an overall severity of medium. And again, this is where, to summarize this, this is where I think that OWASP shows its value to the business. If we take everything into account, even with a critical vulnerability, which if we were using a traditional vulnerability management program, this would be a vulnerability that is top of the list. You absolutely must patch it as soon as possible. But when we take that critical vulnerability and we start taking into account the asset factors and even taking into account the threat group factors, we actually end up with an overall severity in the medium range. Now, this doesn't mean that the vulnerability shouldn't be patched. All it means is that there may be other vulnerabilities out there that are more likely to impact your business in particular that you may want to address first. So this is where it can really help you with your prioritization and making sure that you're hitting, addressing vulnerabilities that are most likely to impact you. And finally, just a few things. I want to talk about things that need to be considered prior to implementing any kind of OWASP risk rating methodology. You're going to want to establish a plan to classify your assets. That's going to be a plan for collecting your inventory and for setting your factors. Now, a lot of places have volume concerns because this step can be cumbersome. There is the ability to utilize asset grouping to combine like assets into a group and then apply those factors across the entire group, which can help you kind of limit the need to have a person or a group of people go asset by asset by asset to apply these factors accordingly. The next thing you're going to want to do prior to implementation is determine your customization needs. You're going to want to figure out, are there factors that you need to add? Are there factors that you're going to want to modify? Are you going to need or want any type of factor weighting? Those great things that we talked about that's so great about how flexible OWASP is, you're going to want to have a plan for how you want to implement those and utilize those for your business. The next piece, probably one of the most crucial items I can say, is have a plan for information maintenance. This is going to include your inventory true-ups, so your asset classification true-ups, as well as factor reviews. These are very, very important to keeping an up-to-date view of the business, asset population, and ensuring that your risk rating system stays relevant. If you only do this once and you let this kind of fall to the side, your risk rating methodology starts to lose its effectiveness and needs to be kept up to date. And finally, as always, you constantly want to be thinking about scalability. How can you automate these calculations? How can you utilize tools to perform this for you so you don't need to have such a large pool of analysts to implement this across your business? And again, the most important thing is to be as adaptable as the framework itself. OWASP is going to be most effective when it is heavily customized to you. It's only going to be as relevant as the work you put into customizing it to your business. So this is a great methodology to use to make your vulnerability rating and your severity more relevant and useful, but you have to be willing to kind of put in the work to make sure that it fits your business model. And that is all I have for you guys. So I will take any questions if anybody has anything. If not, I will be here. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much.